you'll find the show informative. There'll be some things that you know about, and I think some things that you have not heard about. Just a little word of introduction. My wife and I started writing about Matt Canning kind of haphazardly at first because he was the grandfather of our elderly neighbor, Duke Crowley. And Duke was one of the most influential lawyers in all of Montana. He was a self-described street kid, grew up here actually in Walkerville. When he got really ill near the end of his life, my wife, who is both a lawyer and a nurse, was the only one basically he would allow to help him. And so in that process, he kind of became our grandfather, and he just told us the most amazing stories about Butte and about his grandfather. And so this really piqued our interest, and because his grandfather, Matt Canning, sounded like truly an incredibly interesting guy. And so this was really our introduction into really the astonishing things about Butte, especially I'm from Missoula. I grew up there, and Butte was always a place to avoid when you were an athlete, as I was in the 70s, and the renowned gravel football field, and on and on and on. I was also a black belt in judo, but of course that just made me a target. And so a reintroduction back into the really amazing character of Butte was given to us by Duke Crowley, and for which we are eternally grateful. Led to the speculator investigations that we did, and the book that came out of that. Again, tremendously supported by the archives and what they had found, and the coroner's inquest, and maps that they had, putting that all together, and then with the tremendous support from many, many people in Butte, including a number of elderly miners. Floyd Bossard was one of them, Larry Hoffman, Dave Kneebone, and others. So this is back to Matt Canning then, after a several years sojourn into the depths of the speculator Granite Mountain. So in 1917, as I'm sure all of you know, there was a wave of pro-nationalism that washed over Montana and the nation. The U.S. had just entered World War I after Woodrow Wilson did his damnedest to keep neutrality. So war was declared in April 1917, and 10% of the Montana population enlisted or were drafted. There was no other state in the entire nation that had such an incredible proportion of people so willing to fight for it. The Liberty League and Councils of Defenses were formed to push support for the war in various ways, and one of those was to sell Liberty bonds to support the war effort. But basically everything came in under that. And their slogans gradually went from helping seed production and buying Liberty bonds to things like work, war, or jail. You worked, you went to war, or you were jailed. Slackers, anybody who stepped out of that, were fair game. So there's this escalation through this time. And I'm going to come back to some of the reasons why there was this escalation and how it led to this story about Matt Canning and the Espionage Act. You either worked for industry, you either went to the war, enlisted in the army, and were a soldier, or you went to jail. So the statements of people got wilder and wilder. I said anything that sounded anti-war on the other side, where pro-German, was absolutely attacked. This escalated like crazy. People became literally unhinged, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. They started seeing enemies in their fellow citizens, among the people who were, for some reason, many reasons, not enthusiastic enough for cheering for the war effort. So here's an example. E.O. Evans, one of the chief attorneys for the Anaconda Company. His house is right over on Excelsior and I believe Mercury. You can find the little plaque there. He's one of the top industrial attorneys, right? What does he have to say? Our Western country's infested with traitors. They move among us with venom in their hearts and treason on their lips, snarling blasphemies and filthy and profane language. There can be no doubt that the Kaiser has found in them one of his most effective allies. Okay, But he was not the only one. In fact, there was this tidal wave of social hostility toward anything that could remotely be considered anti-war or pro-German. The Helena Independent published a column, and this is typical, breathlessly, "Are the Germans about to bomb Helena?" Have these spies in the mountain fastnesses equipped with wireless stations and aerial planes? Do our enemies fly around the high mountains where formerly only the shadow of the eagle sped? Right? I mean, this is completely absurd hyperbole. And of course, and it's also insane. How in the world could the Germans create secret mountain airports in the middle of Montana and never be seen? Not to mention that a World War I biplane had a range of maybe 60 miles, and the Big Butte Valley was only 9,000 miles away from Germany across the entire ocean without a single military target in it. You know, it's like even the Red Baron would have had a problem causing much trouble in the Big Butte Valley. So, but facts are irrelevant when this goes up, and basically almost everybody was brought into this. And it's something, you know, I don't want to bring too many parallels into what's happening now, because I think they go everywhere. But it's something very worthy of thinking about when you start being very righteous about things. So, you know, there's a current saying among some people that facts don't care about your feelings, but when feelings are strong enough, they don't care about facts. So the overwhelming proportion of immigrants were pro-American. But there were millions of Germans, Austrians, Irish, and some of these people felt loyalty and alliances to the old countries. They didn't want to fight against their families, and some of them strongly believed in socialist policies. They were anti-war by personal experience or politics or ideology or just a religious belief. And the Irish, for instance, many of them were pro-German, they were anti-English. So, and we have to think in Montana here, especially in Butte with the mining, and in eastern Montana, you know, in dryland farming, it's very, very difficult. These people work incredibly hard. Okay, in a homestead or in a harsh dryland farm that's 50 miles from the nearest little tiny town, these are individuals. They don't pay attention to other people. They don't need other people, and they're totally willing to state whatever they have on their mind, point blank, right to your face. These are the same kinds of people that actually could survive in that environment and be successful farmers. No nonsense. So Butte was Montana's powerhouse in 1917. It was the most Irish city in America, as you know. And because of the diversity of 40 or so ethnic groups and 100,000 people, all condensed mostly in the uptown area here, people were more tolerant. They heard people saying the damnedest things all the time. And, you know, around 1910 to 1920, it was estimated that probably 30 to 35% of the people here were immigrants. Another 30, 35% were the children of immigrants. That's 70% or so, right? Everybody was from someplace else. And almost everybody had ties back to their old country. Okay, and the same was true across the United States, but Butte, as usual, is the crucible of the melting pot with all of its incredible strengths and its weaknesses. So, the Irish really are a great example of the problem the war presented. Okay, it's easy to understand that people from Germany have alliances back there, or at least sympathies. And among the Irish, there was a huge reservoir of antipathy against the English, who had ruled over Ireland with an iron fist for the prior 250 years. So there were some Irish who were at least sympathetic to the Germans. Why? Well, here's a couple of things. Historical reasons. Henry VIII, Oliver Cromwell in particular, in the 1600s, invaded Ireland and made it a colony. The Irish were beaten, imprisoned, their land was stolen. Some 90% of the land in Ireland were given to the English landlords, many of them absentee, or people who supported the British Crown. As Catholics, the Irish were prevented from practicing their religion. They had to hold secret, this is this thing over in the corner, they had this little cave-like place, they had to hold secret masses in order to have any religious observances at all. Their priests and bishops were bounty hunted and killed. Okay, they were unable to vote, to own land, to be represented in any way. And there were millions of poor tenant Irish farmers who lived at the complete arbitrary whim of absentee landlords. So that's just a couple of the things about why the Irish, or at least some of the Irish, might have a little antipathy toward the British and a little more sympathy toward the Germans. The renters. I will come back to this with the Irish Revolution as part of this, 1916. This is an integral part of all the hysteria and these tidal waves of social changes that take place. Okay, so we're going to talk about a particular espionage law in particular, or the Espionage Act, and then a particular case. So in 1917 in Rosebud County, the county attorney there, Faulkner Haynes, was an aggressive pro-nationalist, and he was also pro-war. Vess Hall was a German immigrant who lived in the southern part of Rosebud County near Ashland. He was 60 miles away from Forsyth, right? So you either rode a horse 60 miles or maybe you hitched a ride on some derelict Model T truck, right? So it was a ways, there's no railroad spur, no nothing. Now Vess Hall was an immigrant. He was a rancher. He was a hothead and a socialist, and he spoke positively and drunkenly about the Germans, and he disparaged the US and President Wilson. For example, I hope Germany defeats the United States. President Wilson is a British tool, a servant of Wall Street millionaires, the richest and crookedest ever president, right? And a number of other things. Haynes heard of that foul language as they talked in that era, and searched through his statute books and looked for a crime to charge Hall with. Okay, but there were no state laws. And so as a county attorney, he can't bring any charges. But he had an ace in his pocket. As county attorney, even though he could only apply Montana law, he called the U.S. Attorney B.K. Wheeler, who had an office here in Butte, he's a federal U.S. attorney, and asked if he could be the special federal prosecutor and charge Hall under the Espionage Act. Wheeler decided that they could indeed do this. They called a grand jury and they said, yes, that's espionage. 2 thumbs up. 4 counts of espionage against Vess Hall for statements like I just read. Okay, this is basically the law. It's extremely vaguely stated, but basically it comes down to that if you make false statements intended, these are critical words, to interfere with the operations and success of the armed forces, or you obstruct, right, the actions, the intent, the actions of obstructing recruitment and enlistment of men for the services, right? And so these words become critical, as you'll find out. But at the time, Hall was simply arrested and put in jail by Haynes. Okay, what did they do? Well, Forsyth is on the Northern Pacific line. It's also where the Milwaukee line takes off. So on the advice of District Court Judge Charles Crum in Rosebud County, Hall went to Butte to consult and possibly plead with Wheeler. He took the Northern Pacific up the Yellowstone across, finally to Butte. Okay, there may be some railroad aficionados here. If you look at the arrival departures of the trains, there were anywhere between 8 and 30 trains that came through Butte in various directions. And they pretty much averaged, especially on a route like that, maybe 30 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour. They might go at a top speed of 40 in between the stops for coal and rewatering. So it was an all-day trip from Forsyth to Butte. Now, Wheeler was in charge of prosecuting all federal crimes. Okay? The conversation with Hall did not go well. And additionally, Haynes was absolutely incensed that Judge Crum had allowed Hall to go to Butte. So Wheeler summoned this grand jury, and they indicted Vess Hall for those 4 counts of espionage. When Hall came here to Butte, he also hired then one of the best trial lawyers of the time, Matt Canning, to defend him. And Wheeler knew Canning very, very well, because Canning had hired Wheeler a decade before when Wheeler first landed in Butte and got fleeced in a card game and was forced to stay here for a bit as a young law school graduate. Canning offered partnership with Wheeler, and he taught Wheeler how to practice law in the rough and tumble of Butte Silverbow. And Wheeler described Canning in many ways, but one of those was as a brilliant trial lawyer. So here you see in the upper part, Canning and Wheeler. This is 1908, 1909 directory. So a little bit more about Irish and Ireland. Canning was from County Mayo, in the northwestern parts of Ireland. See in the upper part, you see Castlebar. He was from a tiny little crossroads named Ballyferry, which is right under pretty much under the S of Castlebar, maybe 5 miles from Castlebar. Okay, Mayo was one of the poorest areas in Ireland, and was hit hard by the famine, as other places like Cork especially were. There were tens of thousands of people who died of starvation, cholera, and many tens of thousands of families evicted and thrown out of their houses and were just right onto the street. And the history of Ireland in general, and Mayo in particular, is filled with harsh laws created by the British to oppress the Irish. So Canning grew up in the 1870s and 80s. Okay, the average Irishman of the time really had little or no freedom of speech. And during Canning's childhood, there were dozens of acts of English Parliament were passed. Collectively, they're known as the Coercion Acts or the Crimes Acts. There were 100 of them, depending on how you count, someplace between 75 and 105, from about 1816 to about 1890. So, of course, everybody knows about the horrendous famines in the mid-1800s. The Irish were starved. England took substantial food crops from Ireland during that time, their grain and food, and a third of the Irish population from 1847 to about 1850, a third of them died, a third immigrated from Ireland, and 1/3 stayed. Matt Canning's father and mother were among the 1/3 that stayed. Now in the workhouses, which is where the evicted tenants and the people who had nothing to work with or owned no land or had no job, the workhouses where they live, they're filled with cholera, they're just basically deathbeds. The only support then, is that you're given government work. There are projects like grading roads, shoveling ditches, connecting railroad lines. Men, you're so lucky, 8 pennies a day. Women, I hate to tell you, you're only worth 6 pennies a day, right? 6 pennies a day. Now, tens of thousands of poor tenant farmers in Mayo, as well as otherwise, but especially in Mayo, were evicted. In western Mayo, just a couple of miles south from where Canning was from Ballyferry, were the lands of Lord Lucan. Okay, he's an Englishman. He's also known as the guy who in the Crimean War ordered the charge of the Light Brigade, right? Ordered his troops directly into the maw of the best fortified, the best weaponed group, and they just got massacred. So he had the apt name the Irish gave him for the evictions mostly. They were worried about the Crimean War. He was called the Executioner. During the famine, he evicted more than 3,000 tenant farmers from his lands, literally 10 miles south of Canning. Because why? He wanted to lease the land, graze the cattle of wealthy Englishmen, and also to fox hunt. And the evicted had no place to go. What did an eviction look like? It looked like this. The constables came, they shut everybody down, the families shut up inside with sticker bushes everywhere. They're ready with pitchforks and boiling water, and there's a crowd around it. They used battering rams to slam down the door, often in the face of pikes coming out at them, pointed sticks, and boiling hot water. And they destroyed the houses, made them completely uninhabitable, and threw the people out. Merely on the entire whim of the landlords. Of course, they could do things called rack renting, which is, oh, you remember that contract? Well, it no longer works. Here's the rent that you owe for the last 10 years. Right? This is the kind of rack renting. So it's a whole series of things like that. These crimes acts gradually just chop these things apart and start adding crimes. And every time the Irish figured something out that they could get around stuff, another crimes act. Right? So these things made it very easy to evict the Irish. Okay, the landlords could evict them completely arbitrarily, right? They could just throw them out for no reason at all, or they could find a reason, any reason. Police battered down the houses, destroyed them, and threw the people out. If they were lucky, maybe they made it into the workhouses. So the acts allowed arresting and imprisoning people for any questioning they did of the British or constables' actions, for speaking against English rule, for gathering in groups. They suppressed the Irish people's freedom of speech, assembly took away their right to trial, and they tried to force the Irish into silence. Canning was born in 1873. Think about this, if you know a little Irish history, right? He grew up in the middle of the culminating era of this, right in one of the places where all this was coming to a head. One of the main Irish activists, Michael Davitt, who some of you will undoubtedly know, came from Stray, 2 miles up, right from where Canning's wife came from, 2 miles north of Ballyferry. You've heard of Boycott, Charles Boycott, an agent of one of the landlords. He was ready to evict, to do anything. He was known as a terrible, severe, stern person. Okay, boycotting was invented in 1880 when Canning was 7. Just a couple miles south of Ballyferry, Canning would have heard this in the pub that his father owned, where the crossroads of everything and gossip and news came through. So boycotting is social ostracism, right? No one would help boycott or work for him, cook for him, transport him, sell him anything, or even look at him. It was incredibly effective. They drove him out. And of course, because it was effective, boycotting quickly became a crime under yet another one of the Crimes Acts. Okay? So there were these series of laws that just rolled right through the social structure, removing every chance that the Irish had to do something against their oppressors. No land, no rights, no freedom of speech or assembly, no home rule. They were largely treated like slaves in their own country. And of course, here's some of the words. Seditious libel, what is that? Sounds terrible, doesn't it? Well, it's insurrection against the establishment by way of words or speech. What does that mean? Well, with the broadest possible definitions of word or speech or insurrection, right? Anything is a crime, and you could be imprisoned for it. Even cheering the wrong person, even laughing, saying anything, simply being in the way of a constable as he was walking toward an eviction, all of those. Even children were charged with these things. So, I would say in general that when they got to America, nobody understood better or was more able to make full use of freedom and the Bill of Rights than the Irish. Why wouldn't they come? Why wouldn't they? If you had half a chance, half a possibility to escape that thing with any kind of thing, think of the mines here. You have $250 being a timberman, $350, $450, a day for being a miner. It would sound like the promised land. And these people came, as you know. And the people that came are the ones that made our modern world what it is today. But they had a long way to go, and it's not just the Irish. It's every immigrant group and family that came over. I should say a couple things. So Canning's father was a pub owner in Ballyferry, this tiny little crossroads. It was a village of maybe 150, 200 people at its peak. Okay, there's a whole series of acts against the pubs, too. They couldn't carry newspapers like United Ireland, right? Home rule, no go. Irish can't rule themselves. That's against the establishment. That's insurrection. You look at the words and how they're used, right? And so even gathering together, even talking about this, crime, 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 basically all of these are espionage-like crimes. And Matt Canning grew up in an environment where that was the way of life. You can imagine him growing up in the pub and listening to this, listening about boycott, listening about Michael Davitt, listening about the land league, which was illegal at times. He could be imprisoned. His father could be imprisoned for simply having a notice saying that there was a gathering. Now, County Mayo was also known for its priests and spirituality going all the way back through the Middle Ages. And Canning, from a good Catholic family, At about age 15, undoubtedly his mother said, "Our young Matt is very bright, and he is priest material." He was sent away to be a priest at St. Patrick's Seminary, Maynooth, just outside of Dublin. And there, he entered into more silence. Any description that you get of the seminaries and how they were treated, how the individual then is no longer exist. So he's obeying rules, a lack of individuality, and obeying authority. Now, silence in the seminary, as some of you may know, is given names. For instance, the Grand Silence, where the boys were not allowed to speak until the following morning. Matt spent 6 years or 6.5 years there. Then he taught for a year there. And at age 22, in late 1894, he ditched it all and ran away to America with a young Irish lassie, Mina Hughes, who's from Strayed. Matt was 22, Mina was 19, and they were unmarried. Here's the ship's manifest. If you see at the top, it says Matthew F. Canning, 32. He's 32 years old now. Mina Hughes, and he's going to be a merchant, 19. Right? Nil. There's no expression of what she's going to be doing. What's happening here? Well, usually, the typical story was that the man went to the New World, he established himself, got a job, saved some money, maybe even got a house, at least got a stable position, then he's sent home for his betrothed. What are they doing here? Well, Matt's probably, it's illegal for a young unmarried couple, especially a young unmarried woman, to travel alone. They could have been clapped into jail at any point in this. Certainly it was scandalous for a guy who was essentially a priest to be running away with a girl, right? So what is he? At 32, he's her uncle and she's his niece, and that's how they travel. Pretty cool, I'd say. And they went straight to 1895. They got off the train here. They probably came over the pass, came down to the terminal, got off January 25th. Can you imagine coming from Ireland in January and stepping off the train in Butte on January 25th? Yeah, well, So I'm sure it was a shock. But Matt dove into it. He was a miner for several years. He and Mina lived at several different boarding houses. We can find their addresses and so forth. And he worked part-time as a clerk, and then he became the go-to lawyer by being mentored and working at it in about 1904, the go-to lawyer in Butte. Okay, just a little side note about Matt and Mina. So here they are, here they were, uncle and niece. Well, you look at their ages as they're presented on the censuses of 1910, 1900, 1910, so it's pretty interesting. Their ages go all over the place. You'd think coming across, all the way from Ireland would be a very distinctive event. You'd remember how old you were and exactly when that was, but no. These things are all over the place. And as you see, they're actually trying to create a persona here that fit into the normal thing. But if anything, Matt Canning was not a normal guy. He was incredibly smart, incredibly motivated, as you will see. And he was willing to ditch the best job that Ireland had to offer and come to the New World with not his betrothed, but his girlfriend. Mm-hmm. So Matt became very quickly one of the best respected people and professional men in the city, and he became a nationally known attorney. He switched back and forth between defense and prosecution, as many of the people did at that, many lawyers did at that time. He either prosecuted or defended somewhere we get a full count between 60 and 70 murder trials, as well as just incredibly busy business. And his first appearance, actually, you find him in the paper, is in 1902. And I don't know if you know this, I don't know how far this went, but he was a handball champion, Western handball champion, in the handball courts set up on East Park, where they had some all-comers thing, right? He and his partner first trounced the champions and then were trounced in return. He was an excellent athlete. He loved boxing, as you will see in some of his comments here. And he was involved in the most wild cases possible. The Ferris murder trial, which at the time was labeled as the most spectacular in Butte history. Ferris, who's a simpleton, gets implicated, in fact charged with a murder. A train moving from Butte to Rocker seemingly blows up and 3 people are killed. It's carrying the federal mail. What happens is that suddenly somebody says, my God, there was an explosion, right as it was derailing. A dynamite. Somebody stole dynamite. And then somebody says, well, I heard that there were 25 sticks of dynamite missing from the olive leaf mine, which is a few blocks away. This is over near the old Trevoli brewery outside of Rocker. Quickly, $5,000 reward for whoever the suspect is. People come out of the woodwork with their guns. Look at me. You look like the suspect. Right? They find this simpleton guy who's known for stealing and petty larceny all around there. It's him! It's him! And they shoot him as they chase him through. And he, of course, is just thinking these people are trying to murder him. They're a bunch of deranged lunatics. And they finally catch him in the back of this livery stable, and then they charge him with everything. He's in the Murray Hospital, and the room is filled with interrogators, with guys, faking, 2 guys faking injuries, and they're all asking him for 3 days straight about this thing, and they get him to confess. I mean, what would you do if there's 8 guys there constantly berating him? And so he's a simpleton, and he just goes with this. Okay, and then he gets out. He says, Mom, he tells his mother, I didn't do it. All hell breaks loose. Headlines, the fiend who blew up the train and killed these people. Why did he do it? Just for fun. Nobody knows the reason. He just did it, right? Well, that's because he was totally innocent, and he was just going with whatever they were asking him. Well, Canning took that case, and in the process, I think it took 8 days. He brought in all of his old miner friends about dynamite and whatnot. No, the thing was going 40 miles an hour. The train was going 40 miles an hour as it came into Rocker in a 15-mile-an-hour zone. The rails were completely splintered and worn. It crashed, went straight into the edge of a cliff. The boiler blew up, hence the explosion. And there was no dynamite blast, no nothing. And this guy was totally innocent. He was looking at a hanging jury, and there were 2 options. Life imprisonment at hard labor, hanging, right? And they were just totally ready to railroad him. And Canning stood there, and he just demolished the other side. It was amazing to watch. It's all over the newspapers, 1908, 1909. It's pretty cool. So, Canning was known for a whole set of cases like that. My wife and I talked with Dan McCarthy, who died recently, but was a county attorney here, Butte Silverbow. He told us this story that he had heard, that Judge Lynch, you like that name? not if you're a defendant. Okay, Canning defended somebody charged with murder, and he lost. Okay, the ruling and the sentencing was hanging to death right out in front of the old courthouse. So Lynch tells Canning, he'll be hung tomorrow, I'll see you there. In other words, he was forcing Canning to come and witness the hanging of his own client. And Canning responded, I don't believe in that. The next morning, Canning didn't show up. What does Lynch do? He sends the sheriff, who arrests Canning, brings him in a black Mariah, right? The original black Mariah, deposits him there, and he has to watch. He's forced to watch his clients hanging. So Canning took case after case after case, right at the forefront. If you look through the papers, you'll find him all over the place, and some places, where you have to dig a little bit more. He was known for bulletproof integrity. In one trial, when he eventually became county attorney, in one trial he had the entire jury pool dismissed because of their racism. This is 1915, unheard of. It was a Chinese gang war where there were several murders. And the entire jury pool was saying, well, you know what? I'm not going to take the word of a Chinaman against a white man, right? And so the judge got pissed off about this, and he started telling these guys, you can't do that, you can't do that. Canning came in and listened. It's called voir dire, right? So the attorneys on either side are asking questions about what's going on. And they're trying to weed out the people who will rule harshly one way or the other. And so Canning comes in and listens to this for a while, and hears case after case, guy after guy after guy saying, well, I don't care what a Chinaman says, right? So after hearing a little bit of this, he stands up, he looks around, And then he lectures the people. He lectures them on the Constitution of the United States, the Bill of Rights, the Montana Constitution. And then he asks the judge, fire this entire jury pool, get them out of here. They're racists. Can you imagine? Right? 1950. Canning would never back down. And he's just a stuff. The more you find out about him, the more interesting he becomes. So, here's what he looks like. He's known as the Big Butte attorney. He's probably 6'2", towering over people. This is actually coming back from a murder trial, right? He's packing a piece here because he has multiple death threats. And you can look at this guy. Are you going to give him any guff? No. Or if you do, what are you going to get back? Right? So Canning was well known, and he was asked as a miner and a member of the miners' union to speak repeatedly in front of the miners' union and the smelters workers' union. And I'll give you just a little example. You don't have to try to read this yourself. I'll just say a couple things. He's talking about to the miners' union about why you should be in a union and what it entails. And this tells you a huge amount about him as a person. Okay? It's an undeniable fact that almost all occasions strikes have been accompanied by assaults, by violence, and sometimes by murder. I believe it to be true, and I know it to be true, that such things have been and are condemned by every union man, but nevertheless it happens. And what's the result? The very essence of unionism is the protection of private rights. Constitution and laws, they are adopted and passed for the self-same end. And both are systematized public opinion. But when your strike is attended by such acts, as I've mentioned, you at once alienate public opinion, you shatter your Constitution and your laws, and you strike at the very essence and destroy the very foundation of your own union. You at once place yourself outside the pale of law and become at the same time your own destroyers. Some among you may sneer and say that such a doctrine is cowardly, but I'm here today to talk to you as man to man, and brother to brother, and for my opinions, nobody but myself is in any way responsible. I don't think I am as cowardly as the man who, given vent to the pent-up malice of his nature, slinks out into the darkness of the night and under the guise of benefiting his union, destroys the property or takes the life of his fellow man. Such a being is not a union man. He is more fitting tool of a ruthless corporation. And it takes a man to join the union. A decent corporation would not even employ such a person. So he goes on, and this is a speech he's giving to thousands and thousands of people that showed up on 4th of July and Miners' Day. He says, corporations can be dealt with, they can be negotiated with. If a difficulty arises in the course of employment, and they always do arise, define your wants, present them to your employer, approach him not as a cringing slave, but before the law, because you and he are equal, and not as a beggar, because you're not such, and neither a bully, but as a man to man, as fellow man to fellow man. Discuss with him your trouble, arbitrate with him if you will, and if you won't, then strike. And if you strike, be sure to win. I find this one of the most remarkable statements about unionism. This is like 1910, 1912. It's before Anaconda reached its full apogee, or near the depths of what it did. But this is how he saw things. It's a man of incredible integrity. So 1916, the keen appreciation of the Irish for what was going on in Ireland. So the Irish Revolution. Okay, Matt took great care in knowing what was going on in his native home. And his younger brother Joe was an Irish revolutionary. And Canning, actually in Butte, was one of the people who said that our Irish children, must know their history. And he was a chief in pushing the teaching of Gaelic and Irish history in Butte for Irish families. So the Easter Proclamation in 1916 was basically the Irish Declaration of Independence from the British. It was signed by all the Irish leaders. And after days of futile battle, English captured all the people who had signed the proclamation. They were tried for sedition as traitors in secret courts. They were not allowed to defend themselves, and they were all executed. Now just imagine, just take a step back, and what would have happened in the United States if, after signing the Declaration of Independence, every single one of the founding fathers had been executed by the British. To the Irish, England had a special place. They were all shot against this wall. Now, we're talking about hysteria and the Sedition Act. Okay, one of the things that oftentimes with the sedition and espionage cases is they never say what actually was happening internationally and focus on the fact that there were gigantic things going on, you know, that would definitely make you pause if somebody was saying something pro-German. This is not an argument for treating normal people as German spies, but it's just a reflection of the facts of the time. Okay? In February 1915, Berlin ordered its submarines to sink all vessels, even neutrals, sailing within an exclusion zone around Great Britain. More than 100 German ships in response had to force to harbor in the United States ports. The German General Staff, now listen to this, they ordered their spies to mount sabotage operations against every kind of Allied factory for supplying munitions of war, and that included the United States. The United States did not even have an Espionage Act. They had no law on the books, federally, that they could use to charge spies with. It's astonishing, but that's true. So, what happened? Lusitania gets sunk by a German U-boat, May 1915. In Seattle, a barge loaded with 15 tons of dynamite mysteriously explodes in a gigantic vaporizing destruction right in Elliott Bay. Equivalent to an earthquake of 5.5, sinks a ship right next to it too. Okay, in June 1915, U.S. Customs sees a schooner attempted by Irish and German operatives to attack the British in India. What do they have on that ship? 4,500 rifles and 5 million rounds of ammunition to be delivered to the Germans in India. August 1915, federal agents arrest a German agent for plotting to dynamite the Port Huron Railroad Tunnel in Michigan. Black Tom Island, the largest munitions dock and warehouse in the United States. 3/4 of the munitions from going to the Allies in Europe came from the Black Tom Island. It's directly across from the southern end of Manhattan, and what's next to it? Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. 2 million pounds of explosives and ammunition were waiting to be shipped overseas. Shrapnel, black powder, TNT, dynamite. Even just one of the many barges there at the mile-long dock had 100,000 pounds of TNT. The night of May 30th, gigantic explosion. The blast was equivalent to a 6.0 earthquake. It destroyed all the docks along there, shattered windows. They heard it up to Connecticut and down to Maryland. Wow. Liberty State Park is right where this used to be. And you may not know, but the reason why you can't go up to the torch in the Statue of Liberty is because of the shrapnel from this explosion. Eddystone, Pennsylvania, an artillery shell packing plant in Kingsland, or in Eddystone, no, it's a Hercules powder dynamite plant, blew up mysteriously, killing 139 workers, most of them women and children. Kingsland, New Jersey, across the river, again from Manhattan, just upstream from Black Tom, rocked the cities, thousands fleeing, huge explosions, unfused shells flung in the air like a gigantic fireworks display. Halifax. It was gigantic explosions on a munition ship that did this to the city. So it was estimated from early 1915 to spring of 1917, 43 American factories suffered explosions, devastating fires of mysterious origin, in addition to the bombs set on 50 ships for the Allies. So I'd like to ask you folks, what explosive industrial disaster took place in Butte, Montana, November or October 1915? It was right in the middle of all this stuff, all of these dynamite explosions, all of these destructions of industrial projects. Which one was it? The Granite Mountain Dynamite disaster. Nobody ever figured out what caused it. 600, the last shipment of about 2 tons of dynamite sitting underneath a head frame. Mysteriously explodes. Dynamite is not unstable like that. They went through every theory no one could figure out. It shouldn't have exploded. Killed half the ship bosses. and 11 other men. Shut down the thing. Remember, munitions and industrial plants, the Granite Mountain is the biggest mine in the world by a factor of 5. Copper, zinc come out of it, the two constituents of brass. It was said, probably with a little bit of exaggeration, but not much, that 1 ounce of Butte copper was in every single shell shot in the First World War. No one has ever solved this mystery. There's a hole. This is from Tom Malloy back there. Thank you, Tom. He's up there. The blast took place, you can tell right where it took place, about 25, 30 feet north of the shaft. There's a hole right there. There's shrapnel in the girders. You can see it all around there, it's all peppered. So now in light of this, are the fears of the espionage ridiculous, or do they make sense? I'd say they make great sense when applied to the actual foreign spies who were blowing up industrial plants and ships and murdering Americans. But when it moved into war propaganda and then into mere opinion, it became persecution and destroyed normal people's rights. And that leads us to the Vess Hall trial. Men were charged with merely their political opinions. This is a slide of the old courthouse in Helena. Remember, Faulkner Haynes charged Vess Hall with 4 counts of espionage. Matt Canning petitioned and got it moved, motioned for a move from Billings, which was ground zero of the biggest hung juries ever, to Helena, where there at least may have been a chance. So in January 1918, he tried the Vess Hall espionage case. It was the most critical defense of the freedom of speech in Montana and in the nation. He presented his evidence to the jury, and he had Hall testify about the Liberty bonds that he had bought, and that he was a loyal U.S. citizen. And he bought thousands of Liberty bonds. The statements were just barroom talk. And Judge Charles Crum from Rosebud County testified as to Hall's character, vouched for his honesty and citizenship. The state made its case. And then it was Canning's turn with Hall as witness, as Crum. And as Canning made his arguments, he could see the jurors' eyes that he wasn't going anywhere. He was renowned for being able to read the jury. He was an astute attorney. Okay, but that day, I think it's safe to say that anybody could have looked at that jury and know that they were going to string Hall up. Remember, this is the guy that they're going against, though. So all his oratorical skill, even the fact that Hall had done nothing wrong, would not convince the jury, and Canning knew it. But Canning knew the law and he saw the weaknesses. He argued the testimony and the evidence showed that there was no crime committed. Remember, the intent, right? These words that then, the insurrection in the British Act, Canning took every single one of those apart. He said the statements were made in a kitchen, and the intent of action was not present. There was no means for him to carry through any things that he said. There was no possible espionage outcome. There was no way for the defendant to successfully complete any act of violence toward the military. The closest military were hundreds of miles away. There was no recruitment for hundreds of miles. So he wasn't seeking to obstruct the armed forces. The elements of espionage were not supported. They were not proven. And so he comes up, this is barroom banter and opinion. And the government had totally failed to show that any crime had taken place. There was a total failure of proof. He knew the jury was going to crucify his defendant or his client, but he also knew that Judge Borkman was a stickler for the law, and all of his argumentation was specifically aimed at the judge, knowing that every flaw he revealed in the government's case would light on keen ears and a careful, weighing mind. When he finished the case, presenting his case, he turned to the judge and he motioned for what's called a directed verdict. And that strategic request took the decision away from the hanging jury, right as they were tying the noose, and he gave it and put Hall's faith in Judge Borkman's hands. Borkman was known as a careful, critical thinker who would not decide on the basis of hysterical hostility that was sweeping through Montana, but on the law. He agreed with Canning. He found the charges absurd, without supportive evidence, and using Canning's logic and examples, he laid out a ruling that completely destroyed the use of the Espionage Act to criminalize people's opinions. Hall was acquitted and went free. It was a victory for freedom of speech. Word spread quickly. After the trial, Canning heard that people were looking for him. But he wasn't known as the Big Butte attorney for nothing. He'd spent 22 years in the mines, streets, and courtrooms of Butte, and he wasn't going to be intimidated. He went looking for those people, and he found them at the Placer Hotel bar. He stepped right into the bar, right into the middle of a would-be lynch mob, a large group, mostly from Rosebud County, who had hoped to celebrate Hall's prison sentence and his 20 years of hard labor. They included sheriff's deputies from Rosebud County. There were cowboys. They were angry and frustrated at the acquittal. Their fists were itching, and they were ready for a lynching. Canning stepped in, and it's a scene. Imagine Clint Eastwood stepping into a bar, right? He challenges the room. Everybody's quiet. He says, "Is there anyone looking for me here?" So lurking amidst the angry crowd, a deputy sheriff from eastern Montana sucker punched him, and Matt had a few choice words to him as 2 U.S. Marshals escorted him outside. Outside, Canning shook off the marshals and went back inside. To the total surprise of the snarling mob at the bar, he came in again and said to the crowd, "I understand there's someone looking for me." And a man spoke from the side, "Not one, Matt, a dozen, and they're going to finish you." This is the front page of the Helena newspaper the day after. You see gunplay at Montana Capitol. You see up here Judge Borquin holds Hall and just not liable. And down here you see, "Is there anyone after Matt Canning?" Well, it seems like quite a few were. What happened? At the state capitol right after the trial, outside the Attorney General's office, Judge Crum ran face-to-face into the prosecutor, Haynes. They were both from Rosebud County, and each despised the other. Why did Crum go to the Attorney General's office? For several months, he'd been in discussions with the Attorney General about disbarring Haynes for lying and unethical acts as a Rosebud County attorney. The Vess Hall case was just a reason to go to Helena, and he had a gun because he'd received multiple death threats. Haynes, in turn, hated Crum for Crum's own pro-German statements, and he considered Crum treasonous. And then there was also that disbarment threat. And if you add to that, that if the judge were forced to resign, then Haynes himself was first in line for the judgeship of Rosebud County. Haynes was livid at having lost the Hall case. He accosted Crum right in front of the Attorney General's office, accused him of being a traitor and German filth, and then he said in a threatening voice, "There's going to be a killing in a very short time." At this last statement, Crum took out his gun and shoved it into Haynes' gut, saying, "You've called me a traitor, you've threatened my life, I'm going to shoot you right here." Haynes claimed that he tore open his coat and yelled, "My grandfather lost his leg in Shiloh in the Civil War. My father was in the Spanish-American War. Go ahead and shoot me, you traitor." Several days after the Hall trial, Governor Stewart called a special legislative session. He asked the legislature to curb sedition and disloyalty in Montana. They wanted a new act. They were going to call it the Sedition Act. And 2 weeks later, the special session convened. This is 2 weeks after the Vess Hall, after these things, this little bit of fireworks. On its agenda was the passing the Sedition Act, and the other one was impeaching Judge Crum for his own seditious anti-war and pro-German statements. Will Campbell, editor of the Helena Independent, was shouting with every editorial that traitors across Montana had to be shut up. And think about the argument. The argument was that the traitors like Hall were not found guilty and locked up, then there would be violence because the loyal people of the state would lynch them, right? So think about that. No one told the mob to stop its hysterical, murderous crime over the opinions of other people that they disagreed with. No, they just went in, they passed the Sedition Act, and they impeached Judge Crum. As he was being impeached, with a unanimous vote against him, because he wasn't present, he was at his son's side, because his son was dying of cancer. Crum was found guilty of high crimes, misdemeanors, and malfeasance as charged. He was removed from the office of the judge of district court, disqualified to hold any office or honor or trust under the state of Montana. The legislature passed the Sedition Act without dissent, completely unanimously, 2 weeks after the Vess Hall verdict, and Crum was driven out of the state. The U.S. government then passed an identical federal law 2 months later. And with that, they slammed the door on the weakness of the Espionage Act. The mob now had its whip and its club for anybody who spoke in ways that they didn't happen to like. Having the wrong opinion now is going to be punished by fines up to $10,000, which, times that by between 30 and 50 to get the price now, and 20 years imprisonment with hard labor. What happened to Haynes? He quietly quit as Rosebud County Attorney, went into the Army as a lawyer, and disappeared into Europe. This is like 2 days after the impeachment. Sedition Act was intended as a wartime measure. It was used to prosecute dozens of people in Montana and hundreds nationwide. They used that to destroy the Wobblies, most labor activism, and hundreds of labor leaders were put in jail or left the country. The U.S. Federal Sedition Act was finally repealed in December 1920, nearly 3 years after the war ended. So yes, there was sabotage by the Germans. There were serious crimes committed, unquestionably, murder of hundreds of innocent people. But the main target of the Espionage and Sedition Acts were normal people with normal opinions that the mob did not like. And these laws were used in completely unjust and outrageous ways. They were the product of wartime hysteria, and they were the worst laws in the history of Montana and our country. I'll mention that Canning took on a second case later in 1918 after the Sedition Act was passed. This time, the defendant was charged with traitorous speech under the Sedition Act, which, of course, had just been provoked by Canning's last win. So here's the prosecutor's description of what happened to this guy and why he was charged. The defendant willfully and feloniously uttered disloyal, profane, violent, scurrilous, contemptuous, slurring, and abusive language about the soldiers of the United States. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Sounds terrible. He was looking at years in prison and a huge fine. But what did he actually say? What words did he actually speak? He was standing there in his saloon in Deer Lodge on an early summer night in 1918, and he said, "The soldiers are no good. I don't want them here. They're a bunch of bums and thieves." Really? Matt won that case too. The sedition charges were dismissed. But you should take a look at the convictions. Helena, Lewis and Clark County convicted 10 out of 11 such men. Rosebud County convicted 4 out of 4. Custer County convicted 10 out of 13. There was a 97% conviction rate for espionage cases at the time. But somehow Canning won both. When Canning died in 1926, this is the kind of things that were said about him, right? He was extremely well respected, both locally and throughout the city, the state, and nationally. But the Montana Sedition Act stayed on the books for more than 50 years. Thus comes in our elderly neighbor, Duke Crowley. In the mid-1960s, Butte native and Montana attorney Duke Crowley, on special appointment by the government, rewrote Montana's criminal code. Duke, after being a lawyer for nearly 35 years, took special care to first remove the Sedition Act of 1918, finally, from the books. Duke was Matt Canning's grandson. The men in the Placer Hotel bar wanted to finish Matt Canning, but his grandson got to finish the whole damn show. Individual men can fight against tidal waves of war and social hysteria, but if they win a battle, they probably will still lose the war. But Canning shows that the background that we have, each one of us has, focuses us to action in certain ways, to find certain problems and solve them if we can. Judge Borkman remained a thorn in the side of people who wanted to use the Espionage and Sedition Acts, but he did not acquit every defendant tried for espionage and sedition in his court. But then Matt Canning didn't represent them all. So I would say that Canning's reasoning was the truest of heart, went right to the weakest points of abused laws and right to the strength of mankind and freedom. And I think that we can thank people like this, men like this, for the rights that we have. The power of the mob may overwhelm people in the short term, but the rule of law will prevail as long as we have men like this. Thank you. any questions?